Compromise. Usually when you're forced to compromise, you're taking the best ideas of at least two things and mashing them together. Compromising kind of lets you step outside of yourself, outside of your own thinking, and adopt something else that's new, and it might be out of your comfort zone. That's what makes you grow. Usually you're looking at the very essence of something and seeing exactly what is needed and not necessarily what is wanted. But some people think that compromise is a dirty word and that there's a big N-O that belongs in front of it. They want the fastest performing parts. They want them to be quiet. They want them to be portable, and they want them wrapped in luxury. And they don't take no for an answer. And you know what? I respect that. As someone for many years had no interest in compromising in lots of my computer builds, especially my small form factor builds in which I wanted to cram every single thing I could into them, I think it's fun every now and then to go a little bit excessive. This is my story on how I stuffed a 1080 inside of an S4 Mini for a truly no compromise build. And when I say no compromise, I realize there's controversy wrapped around that, especially on the internet, but I feel confident in making that claim. Well, I guess except for price. Definitely was a compromise on price. I don't know if any of you guys and gals are on Twitter, but for the past couple days, I've been talking about some of the hardware that's going in this build. I started off by looking at the new Asus mini-ITX Strix motherboard. It's a Z270i platform, and what makes it special is that it supports dual M.2. The ability to leverage Samsung's 960 flash drive technology in a build this small is a game changer, and the results did not let me down. They were a little bit slower than I was expecting once I got everything rated and the benchmarks running, but that's because I set my RAID stripe to 128K. I do a lot of 4K video editing, and I figured it'd be a good test to try this out. So in synthetics, the RAID did not perform that much faster than a single drive, but let's be honest, nobody is gonna complain about these speeds. But of course, drive speed's only one factor of this build. You need the CPU power and of course the GPU power to back that up. I ran lots of benchmarks, but the two most significant ones were Valley and 3D Mark. Now every single system that goes into my office, I benchmark with Valley. Then I take the benchmark scores and I actually write them on my whiteboard. This way I can quickly reference video cards, processors, and their respective wattage and performance output with a quick glance. Well, this rig succeeded, and it was the absolute fastest system that I've ever had in my office. Well, besides the 1080 and 1070 SLI systems. But for a single card system, definitely the fastest. But also get this, it was the lowest power consumption to performance rig I've ever seen. During most benchmarks, the system hovered at 235 to 245 watt power draw from the wall, and it maxed out at 267 watts. It's like the future or something. Now, of course, we need to stuff this system inside an S4 Mini, so we'd have to tune for heat and thusly the fan performance later, and the system was a little loud, but I didn't want to mess with that quite yet. So with my testing meeting all its marks, it was time to try to stuff it inside an S4 Mini. Now, in case any of you are wondering right off the bat, no, the Zotac 1080 Mini will not fit in an S4 Mini without mods. But this channel is called Not From Concentrate, so modding, it's gonna happen. So to start with, I removed the wraparound bezel on the S4 Mini. Now the inner chassis frame already has a cutout, and this is for installing extra long graphics cards because you wouldn't be able to get past the flanges that hold the side panels on. Doing a test fit, I could gauge just how far the 1080 Mini was gonna stick out, and it was gonna stick out quite a bit. Now because I only had a couple days to do it, and because I wanted to try something new, I decided to go for acrylic. So first I wanted to cut the bezel out of acrylic using my friend's laser, but the acrylic I had been sitting a long time, so the protective sheets actually get oily and they become super flammable. So even if you peel them off, you'd have to polish them really well. So after a small fire, I gave up on that and I decided to painstakingly handcraft the bezel. I don't know where that video ended up, but really it was just a lot of work on the table saw. After the cutting and drilling was done, I surfaced it with some 800 grit sandpaper on the orbital sander. This would make the acrylic look frosted on both sides and I think would give a pretty unique look. Now I didn't want to go with a clear acrylic because there's some holes where the studs were left over for the S4 Mini, and I just didn't think it would look that good. Plus, my theory was that the frosted acrylic would catch some of the RGB LED lighting on the motherboard and light up the front bezel, which could look pretty neat. So after all the sanding was done, it was time to work on my handmade acrylic bender. I've used this in the past to make some panels and it's worked out actually really well. So I'll put some links in the description so you can make your own if you like, but it's just a bunch of door hinges, a couple cuts of wood, and a heater strip. Now, the key to bending acrylic with a heater strip like this is just to be patient. Wait till the heat goes all the way through the acrylic, and when you bend up the panel, there's absolutely no resistance. The problem was I had to do a compound bend, And this was very, very challenging because there was just a little bit of material where both my bends need to be made. So I just kept ending up bending that little tiny bits of material, and it just didn't look that great when I got done with it. There were different ways around this. I could have made a dedicated jig, but that was more work than I actually wanted to do, and I was running out of time. Plus, I tripped over a bucket and smashed my shin super hard, and I just was done after that. So I made another bezel, and this time it was just a flat piece. I know most of you don't care, but I've received flack for it before. The reason I use MAP gas is because it produces an incredibly clean flame and a really delicious smoke. I have a little butane lighter somewhere, but it's always out of itself. Now this actually can be quite relevant because you can use MAP gas to actually heat the edges of super thick acrylic and it won't burn it. Well, it will burn it if you set it on fire, I mean you won't burn the gap. Let's get back on topic. Luckily, I was able to make my small vent plates with the laser, so that saves some time. What I did was I got some 3M Dynoc, which is actually textured vinyl that can mimic different surfaces like wood, carbon fiber, or in this case, brushed aluminum. I overlaid that over the acrylic and then I laser cut it out so it was a perfect fit. With my bezel done, it was time to test fit the GPU and see if I was gonna have to trim the fan. This is what I was worried about because that was going to be very, very difficult to get even trimming on all the blades so it wouldn't go out of balance. Luckily, with the 5mm thick bezel, it was going to be okay and the fan was gonna be able to stay intact. Of course, I was gonna have to trim the heat shroud, but I was expecting that. It's made of injection molded plastic, and I think a Dremel would eat through it quite nicely. But those of you who know me and watch my show know that I absolutely hate Dremels, so yes. Angle grinder with the cutoff wheel all the way, baby. The heat shroud kind of looks like a stealth bomber. It has angular designs, and so I followed the contours as best I could with the angle grinder. So after I got done cutting it, it would actually look quite natural, like it was actually built that way. Now, of course, the angle grinder's cutoff wheel cut through it like butter, but it did leave a little bit of plastic buildup. That was easily trimmed with a razor blade. Honestly, I was pretty happy with the results. It looks almost like it was modded this way from the manufacturer, and once it's put inside the S4 Mini, no one will ever be able to tell a difference anyways. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Why didn't you just use thicker acrylic? If you used thicker acrylic, Josh, you wouldn't have had to cut or modify a 1080, which is a really expensive card. The reason I use 5mm thick acrylic and trimmed the card is because my bezel is 5mm thick. And I wanted to be able to use this as a test case in case users want to take their bezel and take it to a water jet or a CNC and have the edges cut out themselves. So this was for science. Now in the future, I'm going to offer an array of custom front plates for my S4 Mini. They'll be made out of exotic hardwoods, billet aluminum, and of course, really premium cell cast acrylic. That way you can fit the 1080 Mini and not have to do any modding. Well, almost no modding because you still need to fit the DC connector jack for the HD Plex. Now S4 Mini fans who have been putting in really beefy graphics cards like the Zotac 1070 and the Gigabyte 1070 Mini have been modding these DC jacks. And while I wouldn't call them really hard to mod, they're definitely involved and they're kind of scary for most users. However, the mod for this 1080 was super simple. Because of where the graphics card lines up and interferes, you can actually trim it with some dikes. So before I rebuilt on the shroud, I took the heatsink off so I could check out the thermal paddings and the heat goop and see if it got a good coverage. And it did. Zotac used premium heat padding on all the memory and the VRMs and all the little hot components, which I was happy to see because some manufacturers skimp on that and it just, why? It's a $700 video card. The heat goop was also applied quite well and it looked like it might be some good stuff, but I put some NTH1 on it just to be safe. Now the card actually went in quite easy. I was suspect of the PCIe power connector, well, because it extends a little bit further out than the Gigabyte 1070, but actually there was absolutely no problem and you can use normal height PCIe power cables and not have to worry about interfering with the bottom of the case. Well, my cuts were successful because when the moment of truth came, it was apparent that my vent plate was actually going to cover the card no problem. Everything cleared. Well, there's all manner of ways I could attach my bezel and my vent plate, and one of the methods, of course, would be screws. Screws would be quite durable, but I didn't actually want to show screws from the front of my case. Acrylic also welds quite nicely, but I didn't want a permanent fixture because the customer might want to do something else in the future. Also, good to be able to get the card out. Now, my friend and mentor, Bill Owen, and you should check out his channel, long ago made a video about using 3M red Scotch tape. I'm not exactly quite sure what it is, but he actually affixed a computer to his office window. This stuff holds like you would not believe, and it's been awesome for binding acrylic together to just about anything. Now it is removable, but it does not come off unless you want it to. But when it does come off, it doesn't leave any residue, so it's super great to work with. Because of the card's design, its fan, and my generous cutout in the vent plate, I think the card's gonna get a lot of airflow, and it's also gonna be able to eject that hot air out of the case as fast as possible. In fact, I'm hoping that this 1080 Mini is gonna stay awfully nice and cool, because my benchmarks actually show that it's one of the coolest 1080s I have tested so far. It's even cooler than the Gigabyte 1070 Mini, which I don't understand why, but it is. The fans do run a lot louder than the 1070 Mini, so maybe that has something to do with it. Also, it has 2 fans, and the heatsink is longer. Go figure. So one of the negative aspects of trimming the 1080's fan shroud is that you have no fan guard. So if for some reason your 1080 decided it wanted to move a little bit, the fan could end up crashing into the S4 Mini's inner chassis wall, and that would cause damage, and I don't even want to know what else. To prevent this from happening, I used some neoprene and I cut a block and affixed to the graphics card against the bezel wall, so as to prevent the fan from moving up and crashing into the frame. I got this neoprene from the Noctua NHL9 Highs box, so that's another reason to buy that awesome cooler. Now with the power connector plugged into the card and my DC jack also installed and the card installed in the S4 Mini, we are well on our way to having a completed build. Now we just gotta complete the build. Now I tell my case customers this all the time, but the key to making a good build is to test everything outside the case first and to have lots and lots of patience. Of course, we're all super excited to stuff our parts in our computer and get up and running, but the best thing to do is to take your time and make custom cables for your rig. The S4 Mini is no exception. I have to say, this ranks in one of the best looking S4 Mini builds that I've done. As you guys know, you take a lot of pride in the work that you put into building your system, and this was no exception for me. The RGB LED lighting, well, I've never really been a fan of that because I've just seen it on keyboards and mice and fans, but I have to say, in person, this build looks stunning. Asus did a marvelous job not only with the placement of their LEDs, but the controller, and it really just glows and blends like the Northern Lights. It's beautiful. The frosted acrylic turned out to be a great idea as well because it actually catches some of this lighting and itself glows. It's really hard to pick this up on camera and you're not really gonna be able to see it, but I can tell you that in person, this Mini looks stunning and my customer is going to absolutely love it. I hope. Well, if he doesn't, I know one person who would totally love to have it if he wants to cancel. One day I'll be able to afford one. So after it's all buttoned up, I ran a couple more benchmarks to tune and tweak the fans, and they started to actually sound pretty good. I thought I was gonna have to do some undervolting and tuning, maybe for the graphics card and for the CPU, but you totally don't. The 7700K, you actually don't need to do any tuning, which is phenomenal. Now I think I lean more on the 1050 Ti 7700T combo, but that's just me. And well, I say that, but Risen, that's starting to look really good. So there you have it, an S4 Mini build that as long as you're comfortable with an angle grinder, you don't need to compromise. And you have a lot of money. And an angle grinder. Thanks for relaxing with me, guys, and watching this video. If you liked it, you know what to do. I have links in my description for a lot of the stuff that I purchased and used to make this kit. And if you have any questions or need help with your own S4 Mini, you have my email. Well, that Mini is gonna be hard to top. Risen, just saying, AMD.